O tihei Māori ora, hei mihi ana nā mana whenua ki tēnei takiwā, ka te māmoe a Waitaha, kaitahu whānui katoa, tēnā rau koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai ki tēnei whakanui, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, Raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Greetings everybody, welcome along to this very special occasion, the inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Grant Dick. My name is Grant Robertson, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago. I want to welcome all of you here, especially those who join us from outside of the immediate university staff community and student community. It's wonderful that you've been able to come along to this evening's lecture. I want to begin tonight by acknowledging all of those who have supported Grant on his journey. He'll do this, I know, when he speaks, but I do it first because I'm the Vice-Chancellor, so that's how it works. I especially want to welcome along tonight Grant's wife, Melanie, and your daughter Rebecca, who's hiding behind Melanie at the moment, and Grant's parents, Marlene and Colin. Thank you so much for joining us. One of the things all of us in the university community know is that the sacrifices that go into an academic career are large. The commitment of time, the late nights, the long weekends, the deep level of study and commitment that's required, particularly to reach professorial status, is significant. That work is Grant's, but it's also his family and his friends. And I want to acknowledge you tonight for all of the sacrifices, all of the support and the commitment that has gone into supporting Grant. And I'd ask that we show our appreciation to Grant's family for that. I want to acknowledge tonight in the academic party with me, I have Professor Richard Barker, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Sciences, who will shortly introduce Grant to you. Obviously, we have Grant himself. Nice to see you. We have Holger Reugenbrecht from the school, Professor Holger Reugenbrecht from the School of Computing, and Professor Diane Sikapotono, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Pacific. Thank you all for being here. We are always proud of our professors when they have their inaugural professorial lecture. It is, as I've noted, the culmination of a significant amount of work. It's the culmination of, or the celebration rather, of this university's acknowledgement of that work and of the professor who has been granted that title. That pride tonight, for me, has two additional elements to it. Grant is very much a Dunedin person. Born, I think, but certainly bred in Dunedin. And his parents made the extremely wise choice to send him to Dunedin's finest high school. We called it back in those days the Bayview Road Academy for Young Gentlemen. It wasn't. Other people call it King's High School. Now, Grant was the Dux of King's High School in 1996. I had left just a little earlier than that, only a little bit. I never got to be Dux. My excuse, I was the runner-up Dux. My excuse is the Dux ended up being a Rhodes Scholar. So, you know, that's my excuse for why I didn't make it. But Grant is very much a product of that great learning institution in South Dunedin that I also attended. And so I express some pride, Grant, on behalf of your fellow Kingsmen to you having made it here. Grant's very lucky. He may or may not have a picture of himself in his school uniform in his presentation. If he doesn't, I'll put it up later on. But Grant, I want to acknowledge tonight the incredible commitment and work that you have put in to get to this, not just, I might say, in terms of your role as an academic, but also as a researcher, your role as a teacher and the service that you provide the university. And I know Richard will talk more about this now. In order to become a professor, you must show excellence in all of those areas, research, teaching and service. And Grant has absolutely done that. We are very proud to have you here tonight, Grant, to deliver your inaugural professorial lecture. Nau mai, haere mai anō. Welcome again. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'd now like to introduce Professor Richard Barker, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Sciences.
Vice-Chancellor, tēnā koe. Professor Dick, tēnā koe. Professor Sikapotono, tēnā koe. Professor Reugenbrecht, guten Tag. Friends and colleagues, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Grant Dick from the School of Computing, to give his inaugural professorial lecture at the University of Otago. As indicated by our Vice-Chancellor, Grant was promoted to Professor in February this year, and tonight we get to celebrate this significant achievement. Professor Dick was born and raised in Dunedin, as we have heard. He attended St Clair Primary School, Macandrew Intermediate, before going on to King's High School, an excellent establishment where he excelled in his academic accomplishments. In asking for some personal insight for this speech, first of all, Grant said he was very boring and he didn't have much to offer. We beg to differ, but he did volunteer that he has donated twice his body weight in plasma, a very commendable achievement. I can also offer a bit of personal insight. I can attest to the fact that Grant can walk across campus very, very quickly. And I have a little bit of inside knowledge on this because I know it's genetic. And I want to acknowledge Grant's parents, Marlene and Colin, stalwarts of the very fine Caversham Harriers Club, and themselves very rapid walkers who I often see screaming down Melbourne Street on a Sunday morning. Since primary school, Grant has been fascinated by computers and eventually taught himself to program by borrowing his sister's textbook while he was studying at university. So thank you for sisters. His dreams of being a racing engineer working for McLaren were derailed when he was told that computing was a license to print money. So he launched himself headfirst into computing. He is still waiting for the money, but just right now, that engineering role at McLaren is looking a bit of a miss. Professor Dick completed a BSc with honours in information science at the University of Otago in 2000 and then moved into his PhD in 2001. He was supported by a Foundation for Research, Science and Technology Bright Future doctoral scholarship. With a few pauses and interruptions, he completed his PhD in 2007 under the supervision of Professor Peter Wigham, I believe with us in the audience tonight. Kia ora, Peter. This PhD was in evolutionary computation. One of those interruptions was when he took on a research fellowship position at the university in 2005 in our Department of Information Science, which then morphed into the role of lecturer, which he started in May 2006. Promotion to professor at the University of Otago is far from easy, and one must excel in each of the academic domains of research, teaching and service. Professor Dick's research interests span the wider areas of data science and artificial intelligence. However, his main contributions are in the field of evolutionary computation, which we're going to learn a bit more about tonight. His research is both productive, he has 62 published papers to date, and impactful. And in 2018, he won the Best Paper Award in Evolutionary Machine Learning at GECO 2018, an A-rank series of conferences on genetic and evolutionary computation. In his career to date, he has also been awarded just under $1 million of research grant funding, including as a named researcher on a current 7-year Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment Strategic Science Investment Grant, a data science-driven evolution of aquaculture for building the blue economy. And thank you for the prompter to my right. Teaching is the second domain in which our professors must excel. And in speaking to the quality of Professor Dick's teaching, I can do no better than to quote the words of my colleague, Professor Marie Tyne, who wrote the supporting statement for his promotion application. And she said that Grant is an excellent teacher, having taught across all levels over his career, and he continues to hold significant teaching load while maintaining a substantial service role. Grant's excellence and standing as a teacher is evidenced through his passion in delivering accessible content in his teaching materials and the manaakitanga which he shows in his delivery and dealings with students. And further, Grant engages with students and sparks their interest for learning. He is extremely passionate about driving student engagement, demonstrated through his determination to ensure that students appreciate the value of the formative feedback he provides. Significantly, his students themselves have recognised his excellence. In 2014, he was a top 10 finalist in the Otago University Student Association Teaching Awards, and in 2020 he was the Commerce Divisional winner for the Otago University Students Association Supervisor of the Year Awards. The final domain in which our professors must excel is service, and this is service to the academic and professional community. And in this, Professor Dick is a real star. For his professional community, Grant has served as program chair or committee member for a number of international conferences, including as student affairs co-chair for the 2024 Genetic and Evolutionary Computation Conference, GECO 2024, and as senior program committee member for the 33rd AAAI Conference on Artificial Intelligence in 2019. He has given extensive service across the School of Computing, the Department of Information Science, the Division of Commerce, the Division of Sciences, and now and previously the Department of Information Science, as well as service to the wider university. The volume of this service is such that all I can do is call out some of the highlights. For the university, he has served on a number of panels and committees, including as a panel member for the CULT Correro on generative AI in 2023, and on the Quality Advancement Unit Review Panel for the Schools Liaison Unit in 2021, and he was a Schools Liaison Ambassador from 2013 to 2019. For his department, Grant has fulfilled many roles, but most significantly, he served 10 years as Deputy Head of Department of Information Science, and then became head of that department in December 2021. This included leading this department through a difficult restructure in 2022. It then became part of the School of Computing, and Grant is our inaugural head of the School of Computing. To conclude on a personal note, the restructure that I just referred to was difficult, and the first opportunity I have had to work closely with Grant was through this. And leading in these situations is a massive challenge for our heads, as they have to navigate the difficult territory that lies between competing interests and departments and the university higher up, as we may say. His staff know, as I know, that he has tirelessly advocated for their interests and continues to do so. I can also attest to the fact that his work with university leadership is always respectfully constructive and wise. Thank you, Grant. It's now time to hear from Grant himself, so please join me in welcoming Professor Grant Dick.
Vice-Chancellor, tēnā koe, thank you very much for the welcome there. Professor Barker, tēnā koe, and thank you very much for the, what I can say is flattering introduction there. Professor Regenbeck, hello, welcome aboard. And Professor Sika Pitonu, kia ora. And to all of you, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Grant Dick, tōku ingoa. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about my passion project in academia, which is evolutionary computation. I'll get to that in a minute, but first, it is a lecture, so we have the custom. Cheers. I also want to acknowledge that I've watched quite a few IPLs over the last few years. This is going to be a carbon copy of quite a few of them. And so I pray I don't let the team down, so no pressure. So let's start with the background, shall we? About me. South Dunedin, St Clair, a glorious place. I was born in the hard knock streets of St Clair. The biggest battle was between Wilson Ave and Waikola Ave as to who got the sign for the best dressed gardens. We won. Wilson Ave, by the way. And this is me, okay? I was born in Queen Mary, now Hayward College. Too proud, I hope. Parents Marlene and Colin. Hello. I was the youngest of 3 children. I have 2 awesome older sisters, Shelley, who is online, and my sister Melanie, who's here today. They only conspired for fratricide once, as far as I'm aware, but came to their better senses, so thank you very much for that. What can I say? I'll rate my upbringing as safe, simple, and most importantly, boring. And I mean boring in the positive sense, is that there was literally no daily struggles or challenges for any of us in our family. I lived a charmed life. My parents were amazing providers and worked hard to give us the best start in life that they possibly could. If there was any drama in my life, and you will see in a second there is some, it was solely of my own doing. Above all, the only thing I remember about my earliest days as in childhood is being happy. Okay. I went to St Clair School, ironically in St Kilda, and it's fair to say that adapting to school life was, for me, challenging. It was at primary school where I developed my key social and life skills, as reflected in the following school reports. As discussed, Grant has at times displayed mannerisms which can be rather irksome. She was awesome. She was awesome. Mrs. Robinson gets frustrated and upset when things don't go the way he would like. Grant works reasonably well when supervised, but at times lets situations upset him. Grant's work is impeded by the fluctuations of his moods and will have to be more tolerant of others. And the last one, he is a perfectionist and does not like anyone to do better than him. I will take a slight exception as to this particular one here about being not discourteous to others and does not tolerate differences in others. I certainly hope that that's no longer the case. All I can say is my heartfelt sorry and apologies to my fellow pupils at St Clair and the teachers and to my parents for the resulting parent interviews. I think I've moved on, although losing and admitting to being wrong are, well, still challenging. Sorry, Melanie. So following primary school, I had the typical intermediate experience, Macandrew Intermediate. I can't remember a single thing about it, so let's move on. Yes. These are the only two pictures of me on record at high school. My high school years were spent desperately trying to fly under the radar. I did play the occasional sport, basketball mainly, but my preferred area was in academic endeavours and the practice of karate. I was fascinated by computers, as alluded to in the introduction, and I learned to program by borrowing my sister Shelley's textbooks from her own university studies when she went through and did an information science degree before I did. Now, as was mentioned, my dream was to make it big in Formula One, either as a driver or an engineer. Computer design was big at the time in Formula One, it was breaking, so I thought that might be my angle in. My extended family is a somewhat long line of bogans. My uncle was editor of Driver magazine and managed to secure my father and I press passes to the 1996 Formula One Grand Prix in Melbourne. I was literally living the dream. I say again, I had a charmed life, and I apologise for going on about the Grand Prix yet again. Okay. I dabbled in motorsport at the time, around the time of starting university, although I quickly established that I had neither the budget nor more importantly, the talent to proceed through to Formula One. My biggest claim to fame in motor racing is in the ODT report of the 2002 Dunedin Street Race, written by our famed SARO director David Thompson. It was mentioned that in the Otago Sports Car Club event, it had to be red flagged due to, quote, a crash by one of the slow cars at the back. Let the record state that I object to be called slow. I was winning my class at the time. However, clearly I was not destined to be a Bruce McLaren. So, on to my university studies we went, okay, which were fairly plain sailing, to be fair. I ended up with a BSc Honours in Information Science. At the end of my 1999 third year, I was needing to start thinking about a project for the following year. By coincidence, a new academic joined the information science staff in late 1998, and he was working in a strange but fascinating field called evolutionary computation. Interestingly and conveniently, during my third year of studies, I was quite intrigued by the game called Creatures. If you've never played it before, think Tamagotchis on steroids. I didn't understand the details, but what I did know about the game and what I was fascinated about was that the creatures in the game evolved as some form of artificial life. In each creature, there was a genetic markup. That markup defined their behaviour. That through breeding in the game, the genetic information was passed on to the offspring in the game. It truly was a form of evolution in silico, evolutionary computation. Also, at the end of my third year, I approached that new academic that I just mentioned and said that I'd be interested in a project in evolutionary computation. That academic was Peter Wiggum, whose response was, great, and then proceeded to hand me an 800-page book of useful background to read over the Christmas and summer break. So we were off to a great start. So I completed my honours with Peter, supervising. Around the same time, I met Melanie Middlemiss, an energetic, funny, although to be fair, sometimes unintentionally, and talented master's student in the information science department. She said she was interested in pursuing a PhD. I was interested in pursuing Melanie. An academic life, to be fair, also sounded quite intriguing. So off we went and commenced a PhD as well. I was under the supervision of Peter Wiggum and initially under Martin Purvis, rest in peace, and later Colin Aldridge. Right, let's take a break from my life story because we'll come back to it a little bit later. I've talked about evolutionary computation a few times now, so let me explain the concept. So like neo-Darwinian models of evolution in natural systems, evolutionary computation is remarkably simple to define, but the devil is in the details. Essentially, it can be boiled down to as follows. If a solution can be defined by a set of parameters that drive some behaviour or outcome, then different collections of parameter values are likely to give different outcomes of behaviour. And thus, this gives opportunities at solving a problem. If we maintain a population of these parameter sets, let's call them individuals from now on, then it is likely that some individuals will work better on the problem than others. If we focus our attention on those that are better solutions, in other words, we select those individuals, then we can produce new solutions from them by varying their parameter sets. For example, by randomly assigning new values to some of the parameters in the list. We call that a mutation. Most of the behaviour of the offspring will be inherited from its parent, but changed slightly through the mutations it receives. Hopefully this change in behaviour will lead to better solutions. Of course, most of the time it won't, but occasionally it might. And if we repeat this process many times, then an evolutionary trajectory of improvement will emerge. So, evolutionary computation is very easy to define as a concept, but as I said, and hopefully we'll demonstrate later, it's not so straightforward in its implementation. So these are the three main operators in evolutionary computation: selection, mutation, and crossover. I've just mentioned selection, which essentially serves to amplify the presence of good behaviour in the population. Mutation attempts to exploit the products of selection by producing a small variation, for example, a point mutation to change the behaviour of the offspring. While crossover takes two parents and produces offspring from some intermediary into some intermediary form, combining the traits of both parents. All right, let's look at an example in action. This example I'm about to show you actually has all the same basic ingredients as the creatures game I showed you before, albeit in a much, much simpler environment. So let's consider a game where we have a virtual world, and the goal of the world is to contain agents, and unknown to them, their goal is to collect as much food in a given time as they can. They have very limited information about the environment. In fact, all they are given is the location and orientation relative to them of the nearest piece of food, and the orientation and location of the nearest agent in the population that is also trying to ultimately eat the food. So the question is, how do we use this limited information, and how do we get interesting behaviour to emerge without expressly telling the agents what to do? Note that this is in contrast to something like reinforcement learning, where an agent is rewarded directly as a consequence of taking the right actions or wrong actions, punished accordingly. Here the agent is given no feedback other than a score at the end of the round. So, how do we actually make this work? Well, we could use a neural network. I'm not going to explain neural networks today, but what I will say is that we can define a neural network in terms of a list of parameters that they contain, which are the weights between the nodes. If we turn those weights into a list of numbers, we now have a data structure that is amenable to being passed around, propagated, mutated, and crossed. So, we have the unit of evolution that we can pass around and propagate and select and so on. Let's try it, shall we? Time for the almighty risky demo. Okay, I'm going to hit reset. Okay, so here we have our agents and our food. And if we look at the initial generation, their behavior is, well, frankly, rather uninspiring. There is differences in behavior, absolutely. But what we are finding is that those differences are not sufficient to actually get any meaningful evolution taking place. Sometimes they do find some food, but it's more likely because they are just randomly bouncing onto those pieces of food rather than any concerted effort. All right, let's now accelerate time. So what's happening on the right is now that the animation is no longer happening, but the evolution is still taking place. At the end of each of those iterations, some individuals are being sampled, crossed, and mutated. And we can see within a relatively short time frame, we now have a bunch of bunnies racing for the carrots and in a far more coordinated fashion. There's no more random fluctuations. They are directed. They have evolved to understand, without even being told, that this is their goal. Okay? So let's just stop that for now. I'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, so that was a simple example of the game. What about something slightly more complicated, but still pretty simple? Let's put in predator versus prey. The goal here is pretty much exactly the same as the goal we saw before. The difference now is that in addition to the foraging agents that we had, we now have some predators in there. Both of these structures are given both of these organisms or agents are given exactly the same neural networks. They are just fed one more piece of information, which is the location and orientation of the nearest predator. The most important thing to understand here is that both the predator and the prey get exactly the same representation. The only thing that's going to change on them is the score that they get at the end, which is going to be assessed through slightly different rules. Okay. Beyond that, evolution should proceed exactly the same. So let's give it a go. Okay, so we can see for some reason the predators do this whirly thing that just makes them look crazy, like throwing stars. But again, nothing much really inspired happening. Variation in behavior, but nothing coordinated, nothing intelligent in any way. Okay, let's let the evolution run for a bit. Stop it about now and see what's happening. We can start to see that there is certainly behavior going on. We can actually see, if you look closely, there is actually an attempt by the foraging agents to try and avoid the predators. We don't have it happening right now, but if we continue the evolution for a little bit longer, what you'll actually start to find is that the predators will actually stop on the food, and they'll use the food as bait. And they'll wait for the foraging agents to come and then take them. So you can see same basic mechanisms of evolution, but a different behavior emerges. We don't need you anymore. Goodbye. Okay. So those are two simple examples. What else can be evolved? Well, quite literally anything that has a data structure to it that can be manipulated in some way. I'm only going to draw your attention to two things here. The one on the top right is called symbolic regression. I will talk about that in a few slides' time. The one on the left is an antenna designed through evolution by natural selection. That particular antenna, to me, looks broken. But because evolution can design things outside of the realm of what humans would consider to be acceptable bounds, it can go outside of those parameters and achieve results that are beyond human competitive and actually outperform what a human would be capable of designing. So this is actually a mechanism that's used by NASA to this day, I believe. Okay, there is also Another thing, and this book here was actually something that was a strong inspiration to me in the early days of my PhD, called Blondie 24, written by David Fogel in 2002. I don't have time to explain the full details here, but this is another example of using neural networks and evolving those neural networks, but in this case, it was to develop a professional drafts player. Now, for those of you familiar with the concept of AlphaGo, this is actually a very similar setup to AlphaGo, albeit on a slightly simpler problem, but done almost 20 years earlier, and using evolution rather than reinforcement learning. The book had a fundamental impact on my enthusiasm for evolutionary computation. It also had a number of interesting discussions and challenges about engaging with online communities as part of your research. I won't spoil it, but the reason it's called Blondie 24 was to increase engagement on online participation. I encourage you to go and find it. It is in the library. It's a short but good read. David Fogel also wrote around the same time an article in IEEE Spectrum. And David has to form both hero and villain in this story today. In attempting to increase the appeal and a broad appeal and approach of evolutionary computation, Fogel made what I think is a critical error in judgment. He said the following: to be useful, traditional algorithms for discovering the most appropriate solutions, optimization algorithms, require that users make many assumptions about how to evaluate the fitness of a solution. These traditional means of evaluation go by many names, yada, 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 yada. But evolutionary algorithms require no such assumptions. And that sounds honest and genuine, and I believe there was a genuine attempt to convey that evolutionary algorithms do not require such assumptions to be made. And you saw in the previous examples that there weren't many assumptions about how the world worked. It was just a score that was given. Unfortunately, many in the EC community interpreted Fogel's statement more along the lines of evolutionary computation must not use domain knowledge. It isn't biologically accurate to do so, forgetting that we are working in a silicon environment, not in a natural system, and also forgetting that biological evolution is actually not that efficient anyway. This encouraged some researchers to treat evolutionary computation as a locked black box that must solve all problems through the magic of evolution, rather than trying to adapt or design the evolutionary processes to exploit available domain knowledge where possible. We entered into what I call the EC winter, in parallel with the AI winter. The end result was evolutionary computation theory going underdeveloped, with a rush towards these nature-inspired algorithms. And there is an online repository called the EC Beastery, and I suggest you go and have a look at it. It's quite funny. But unfortunately, what was happening was individuals were publishing new algorithms every week, rather than trying to think about the bigger picture of how to integrate evolution into an effective search. This has had lasting damage to the reputation of evolutionary computation. Even to this day, there are reputation issues with the method. Okay, it's time to be honest. My first 3 years as a PhD student didn't go well. I was bent on advancing theory, but not really getting anywhere, and somehow had convinced Peter to give me too long a leash in my studies. Fortunately, Peter did see some potential in me, and along with Professor Hamish Spencer, offered me a research fellow position to support the UORG that they had just received. This UORG was in the area of population genetics, looking on population structures within population genetics. This led to a 1-year journey of me moving away from my PhD and towards more general population genetics, and was a blessing for my own studies. The work ended by aligning very strongly with my PhD studies, and in addition to getting the work done on the UORG, reinvigorated my PhD. In addition, some excellent papers were produced. One in evolutionary computation, but 2 in a more general population genetics model. Okay? And I don't have time to go into what's on the right-hand side here, but basically that is showing over time, going down the page, an evolutionary dynamic of genes structured in a ring formation, and showing the local convergence but global diversity being preserved. And we developed some fairly convincing models about how they were formed and how long they would survive, and so on. So from EC to population genetics and back. Through a mixture of deferrals and part-time study, I was finally able to finish my PhD, incorporating some of the knowledge that I had unlocked by working with Peter and Hamish on the UORGs. So there was light at the end of the tunnel. and I thank my sister for proofreading, which to this day got me through. My career took a final positive turn in 2006, where I was offered a position as lecturer in the Information Science Department, and I've been here ever since. Sorry, or you're welcome, I'm not quite sure. Of course, as part of an academic life, I needed to choose some sort of research area to work in. Despite the reputation damage, I still had a fascination with evolutionary computation. However, I was distressed with the angle and direction that most research in the field was taking, so I decided to join a growing community of academics that were interested in attempting to push back on the work being done and revisit some of the existing work that was out there. Hopefully, I would be able to shed some light on these methods, expose their shortcomings, and allow the community to self-correct, because that's what science does, right? Spoiler alert, I was young and naive and a little bit stupid. Somehow, I also convinced Peter, now a colleague and my mentor, that working in this area would be a good idea. Peter, in his own IPL, has already talked about some of the work that we did in this area, and along with James McLaurin and Caitlin Owen. Actually, where was Caitlin? Sorry. Hi. I won't repeat what we did here in that work, but what I will mention that Peter didn't mention in his talk was that our first attempt to publish the work that you see here, which was roughly a 5,000 word paper, received a strong rejection and a 14,000 word response from one reviewer. At least we knew we were getting a reaction. Instead, what I would like to focus on for a few minutes is a paper that we published in 2015, and unfortunately the end result is not quite so positive. The background to this work has an interesting anecdote. Remember my school reports? I don't like losing. Attending a conference to present some of our other work, authors responded to Peter that our method would be inferior on their challenging real-world bioavailability dataset because it contains real-world issues. This particular dataset was gaining increasing exposure in the EC community as the authors were making it easily available, and researchers are often desperate for any data that they can get. So challenge accepted. We acquired the dataset, performed some initial runs, confirmed that we were not able to beat the opposition, but they couldn't beat us either. And in fact, actually, it seemed like no method could be reasonably applied to this problem with any success. It was time to explore. We discovered that far from being a real-world problem with challenging attributes, the dataset was filled with all sorts of oddities. Not error or noise or anything like that, but something more substantial. We noted that there was a vast number of columns, 20%, that contained no information. As in the columns themselves had a standard deviation of 0. There was nothing in them. What's worse is that the general signals of the dataset suggested that there are repeated columns that were clearly identifiers, columns that were clearly sums of the other columns, so linear dependencies and so forth, and the underlying patterns of the data, as shown here, which is this is the dataset in question on the left, did not follow the conventions that you would normally expect for the relationships within a dataset. Now, this came about because of that culture in evolutionary computation to not look at the data. Okay? So, we also noted two particular things. One, when evolutionary computation was applied to this dataset, by far and away, the most frequently used columns were the ones with no information. The evolutionary trajectory took the approach that avoiding the use of any information and making a prediction was the best way to achieve a solution. Also, all of the results in previous work easily fall into the range of the standard deviation of the target variable, somewhere around 30 as a root mean squared error. In other words, previous work had achieved nothing better than predicting the mean of the data. However, what was particularly odd, and I say that in a gentle way, was that these papers somehow managed to obtain and report a significant difference in performance between algorithms on the dataset. I won't explain why that is, because we're not getting anywhere if we do that. In the end, we could not do anything other than recommend that this data set be avoided for benchmarking purposes. Paper submitted, accepted, off we go to present. Presenting this work at the conference was interesting. Claims of hostility and personal attacks. Also of interest was that the very next paper proceeded to present results on this data set, shown here, with exactly the behaviour that we had predicted would come out. The best method had a root mean squared error of around about 30. Okay? So, afterwards, many academics at the conference, and also via email, contacted us to say thank you for doing the work. This sounded promising. Change was inevitable, right? So, this actually raises an important question. How does one evaluate research that is going out of its way to not be cited? Okay? There was no way that we could, or it should, expect our paper to be cited. The message was clear. Don't use this data set. There is no need to cite us to say, don't use this data set. Okay. However, we thought we could tackle this approach by using secondary evidence. If the use of the data set dropped subsequent to us publishing the paper, then we perhaps could claim some success. And indeed, that was what we saw for 2016 and 2017 at least. And if you look at the table here, there are two data sets that are described. It's very hard to read, but if you look at the table here in 2015, there are three. These were always put in a triplet, and this one here is the data set that I was referring to just before. So immediately you saw that instead of showing up as a triplet, they're now showing as a pair. And the very one that we said don't use was the one that was missing. So we were thinking, oh, maybe reviewers are getting in there and going, don't use this data set, and they're striking it out. We had another paper which we went and had a look at, and again, there was an odd behaviour that you had the two data sets that usually go hand in hand with the third, and now we've got a random third one. And we had another paper that had a conspicuous gap where there would normally be an eighth cell of results, because why would you have an odd number of results? And if you did, you'd at least centre align the bottom one. So clearly something was going on here. These were all 2016 papers. Sadly, 2018, the bioavailability data set is back. And now here we are in 2024, where not only are we told to include this data set, we are actively being cited as a reason for using that data set. So, I find it ironic that this is an entire paragraph discussing about what characteristics of a good benchmark data set should be, and one of the sentences, it's not our objective to discuss what characteristics a good benchmark should possess. So, it was apparent that there was some other approach that was needed to actually try and be positive and constructive towards changing the ethos within evolutionary computation. Round two. So I mentioned earlier the concept of symbolic regression. Symbolic regression is, in typical regression, we fix the shape of the equation and we fit the coefficients to that particular equation to model the data. In symbolic regression, we model the equation as a tree that can be manipulated and changed through evolution. Therefore, we are searching for both the equation structure and the corresponding coefficients for that model. Symbolic regression is having something of a resurgence. The physicists have gone mad on it because there's a data set called the Feynman data set, which is apparently modeling a whole bunch of interesting physical phenomena. It's also had a bit of resurgence because there is a motivation towards interactive, semi-automated data science. And I absolutely will not comment on that right now. One of the interesting problems with symbolic regression is bloat. Because we impose no restrictions on the size of the equation, evolution has a natural tendency towards building larger equations. So, in a 2014 paper, we published a paper that first explored the relationship between bloat and model performance, and found that rather than leading to problems of overfitting data, there appeared to be no strong relationship between the size of the model and its performance. Interestingly, the same phenomena has subsequently been discovered in a range of other places, and it's now referred to as the double descent problem. These papers have been cited thousands of times. Oh well. It was clear that the theory behind symbolic regression was underdeveloped. So in 2017, I was awarded a UORG, thank you university, that would help explore this further, and had the fortune of recruiting Caitlin Owen as a research assistant to work with me and again Peter. This led to many successful outputs. We had the paper that Richard referred to earlier before that won best paper at the conference, which was an attempt to bring in more rigorous machine learning theory into the realm of symbolic regression. Caitlin carried on to complete a PhD under our supervision and developed a technique that allowed us to further examine the sources of error in evolutionary computation in a more refined manner with greater detail. And then we were able to identify the primary sources of error in symbolic regression, not through a random trial and error and see what sticks, but rather through a coordinated examination of its behavior. From this, we were able to design a handful of optimizations to the canonical method of symbolic regression, which was invented in 1989, or first published in 1989. We entered our revised baseline canonical method into a new benchmarking competition. Along the way, we examined the benchmark itself for suitability. We couldn't help ourselves. And reported on several shortcomings of the dataset. Interestingly, our method, based on a canonical approach over 30 years old by the stage, ended up being within the non-dominated set of methods, meaning that there was nothing that outperformed it over the range of criteria that was being assessed. If we looked purely at model performance, it was the best method. Why is it not coming up? So GPZGD, the GD doesn't stand for Grant Dick, by the way, it just stands for gradient descent. GPZGD was the best method in terms of pure model performance, but if you trade off model performance with model size, it was in the non-dominated front. So interesting, a method that was 30 years old was still state of the art. This has led to a paper literally hot off the press called Call for Action Towards the Next Generation Symbolic Regression Benchmark. I'm kind of disappointed they didn't come and approach us, but fortunately the story does have a different tune from last time. Rather than ignoring the issues that we raised in the benchmarking suite, this community has embraced those findings and has used them to create a revised benchmark. Our canonical approach was included in this result. Fortunately, we are no longer state of the art, but only just. We missed out by 0.01. The cutoff to get into the first criteria was 0.7, and we were 0.69. Okay? More importantly, methods based on large language models and transformers, the current flavor of the month for artificial intelligence, are flat out terrible on this problem. What was very interesting, however, was that our particular method is highly energy efficient and uses an order of magnitude less energy. Thank you. We didn't know this, and we didn't even try it. Something that we had not previously considered looking at. All in all, this seems like a very healthy and welcome approach to benchmarking. And it seems the community may finally be breaking away from don't look at the data mentalities and towards a future where evolution is tightly integrated with rigorous analysis and incorporation of domain knowledge. A lofty statement to make from one paper, I know, but I can dream, right? So, why have a future with AI, a future of AI with evolution? Well, one of the criticisms of evolutionary computation in the past was that the computational scale was too vast. We are now living in a world where computational scale is making these sort of things viable. It's without doubt that we are reaching some sort of scaling limit with the existing AI techniques, and future AI techniques will likely blend a mixture of symbolic and neural information and neural approaches. Most importantly, the combination of evolution and neural networks, as you've seen in the raft of examples that we've shown in the beginning, is both flexible and effective. And we have finally gained some good advances in embedding domain knowledge into evolution. I would point out that actually we do have a person in the room, Professor Peter Wigham, who actually talked about embedding domain knowledge into evolution in the early 1990s. So the fact that we're going back to that sort of mentality, it's a useful reset. Okay, so the future of AI and what is our role? I'm actually going to go off-piste here because A, I'm running out of time, and B, this is a bit ranty. So, We know that AI is invasive. It's entering into all sorts of products and technologies at the moment. We know that our students are obsessed with using it in their day-to-day work, and fair enough, why not? Why wouldn't you alleviate the burden of thinking? Sorry, I didn't mean to be that snarky. So what is the future of our role? Well, I think we should probably take heed of the fact that AI companies asking their job applicants not to use AI in their job applications as a warning sign. I also think that it's interesting that the very proponents of artificial intelligence and mass adoption of artificial intelligence are doing work to recognize what are the critical thinking skills of the people using AI and are open to admit that it is eroding their critical thinking skills. We have a lot of work to do as a university. All universities have a lot of work to do to improve this. We are rapidly running into an era where our graduates will be unemployable because they are eroding their critical thinking skills. They are not aware of the damage they are doing in terms of being able to expand their horizons. The current AI techniques that we have are entirely interpolative. They are not extrapolative. They do not think outside the box. They only are bringing in. So the generation of new ideas in these students is going to be a crisis if we are not careful. That doesn't mean wholesale rejection of AI, and it does not mean wholesale adoption of AI. It means a measured response. And without that, with a shameless plug, I would then say that the School of Computing and the Centre for AI and Public Policy would be excellent ambassadors to incorporate into any framework that is looking into the adoption of AI at the university. All right, that's the research done. About me now. Okay. So we've come to the end of my talk. Where am I? Well, first and foremost, I am happily married without the best decision I ever made, even if it did take a while. My daughter is a little me. You saw my school reports. We love you. Our cat Quinn looks at me with absolute disdain, but I know she secretly loves me. I feed her. And despite the current climate brought on by many things, Otago Whakahiku is still a great place to work, has amazing colleagues and students, and I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. In terms of my day-to-day life, I have inherited the genes. I do like running a lot. As was mentioned, I am a proud plasma donor, and I think it is one of the easily the most important things that we do as a society, and one of the easiest things that we can do, and I do encourage all of you, if you have the opportunity to do so, to do so. I'm currently at 175 donations, and I am in the little leagues compared to some of the other people that have been contributing. So please, that's my societal thing for today. As I've said, I'm very happy in my family life. I have all my family around me, all my extended family around me. I have two amazing sisters who I really do not appreciate anywhere near enough. And so that leads into general thanks. I don't have time to do this now, but I want to say thanks to Mr. Shanks. He was my high school chemistry teacher. He tricked me. He did a really good job of making me question everything. And if you want to know the story, I'll tell you later. I want to thank my research collaborators for keeping me sane. I use that term a lot, but I do genuinely go off the rails sometimes in terms of what I want to do in research, and everybody here does tend to keep me a bit tempered and well-mannered. I haven't published with all of these people, but I have been co-funded with them. I have been running workshops and stuff with them as well, and they are all great people. My legend in the School of Computing, as pointed out, this has been a difficult couple of years. You have nothing but admiration from me in the way that you've conducted yourselves. This is a slightly out-of-date School of Computing photo. We need to get an updated one. But yeah, thank you. You guys are absolute legends. My heads of departments and my PVCs, I have learnt an awful lot from you as well in going through the cycles. It's a thankless job. I now know. It's a punishing job, but I would say that every single person that on this list here, as a leader, has done their absolute best to hide that hardship from their staff. So, kia ora te all. And then finally, I want to say thanks to Peter. There are so many things in my life that you have hit and you have touched on in everything. I'm really going off piece now. It's remarkable that whenever I look at the significant events in my life, you're there. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing sometimes, but rest assured, I would say I owe everything to you in terms of my academic life and in terms of my social life. You're always there as well. So, kia ora, Peter. And with that, thank you. Can I sit down? That's it.
Tēnā koe, Professor Dick, tēnā koe, Vice Chancellor, tēnā koe, DVC, tēnā koe, PVC, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Holger Regenbrichter ho. Tēnā rawa atu koe. This was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I was asked to provide some comments about the significance of this lecture, and I'm more than happy to do that. And I'm focusing on three things. So the importance of understanding AI, artificial intelligence. The second one is the importance of methodology. And the third one is the importance of evolutionary computation. So as we all know, our modern world depends heavily on AI, more and more so. And it's of paramount importance to understand the inner workings of artificial intelligence. And Professor Dick contributes to that understanding in two ways. By teaching our students AI methods beyond that black box approach of just putting things in and getting things out, and by developing AI as a profoundly important field within computing. So he addresses questions on how to appropriately use and how to responsibly develop AI for individuals, for businesses, for communities, and for society at large. Second part of this is to ensure rigorous and ethical research practice, including the development of an academic culture to report on negative results, right? So in other disciplines like psychology, we would have methodologists, but in computing, we don't. Yet. So Professor Dick would be an ideal candidate to be a computing methodologist. Tēnā koe. Third, as pointed out in the lecture, evolutionary computation is a field of AI that uses principles of biological evolution to solve complex problems. So Professor Dick's work might also lead to evolutionary computation to be used to understand the complexities of biological evolution. We could call this the ARCO, the teaching and learning of evolutionary computation, right? I would like to finish with mentioning how Professor Dick's PhD supervisor, Peter Wickham, and I was about to say is on stream because he can't be here, but he is here. Peter, it must be a proud moment to see your student to be here as a full professor giving his IPL. So, and part of that is also your, and Grant mentioned that. Also, I would like to say that Professor Dick is a wonderful colleague, is a wonderful academic citizen. Tēnā koe. Please join me in thanking Professor Dick for this insightful IPL and for being such a good head of school. Thank you.